Hi, I'm Eric Benfeld with Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia Tech, and I'm for the soil, both for my children and future generations, viable agriculture, local waterways, and the protection of natural resources. Thank you for being part of this conversation and the For the Soil podcast.
This is a special edition of For the Soil, a conversation. Welcome, everyone. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii, and I know I use the word special a lot, but this one is unique. It is the first anniversary episode of our podcast, For the Soil, a conversation. And looking back over the first year of this podcast, we have talked with a lot of very interesting people, and we've broached a lot of interesting topics, everything from commercial agriculture to backyard gardening, how all of us can improve soil health in whatever situation we might find ourselves. And the purpose of this episode is kind of a best of episode. We're not going to be able to include everybody we had on during the first year, but we are going to include some special moments, if you will, of the podcast. So happy anniversary to us. I think we're going to serve up some soil cake later in the day and celebrate the first anniversary of the podcast. And thank you, listeners, for subscribing. Thank you for tuning into this podcast. Every other Tuesday it is published, and of course there's a lot of information at the website forthesoil.org, and that's the digit for thesoil.org. My thanks also to my co-host during this first year of For the Soil, a conversation, Mary Sketch Bryant with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition, and Eric Benfeld with Virginia Cooperative Extension Community Viability. Thank you so much, guys, for everything that you do in our agricultural community and specifically with this podcast. And with that, let's get to the best of the first year of our podcast. This first segment is with one of our first guests, Dr. John Galbraith. We've got a lot to talk about in this episode. I've watched some YouTube videos with Dr. John Galbraith, who is a renowned resource in Virginia and really nationwide on soil geology, soil types, and soil health. And I've been watching some of those YouTube videos, Dr. John, and I have to say that I have learned a lot. As a matter of fact, I'll kick it off with saying I've learned a brand new word, Pocahontas soil. And I'm a fan of history, so I know a lot about the history of the Pocahontas Indian tribe, but I had no idea that it's a soil type. As a matter of fact, it's the primary soil type I've learned.
It is. In fact, it's such a special type of soil that it was selected to be our state's nominee as the state soil. And one reason for that is that it forms along the major rivers that flow across the coastal plain. But in particular, the James River is really a nice representative river for Virginia because it flows across 4 of our 5 physiographic regions. And so the soils that are deposited on the floodplains and terraces of the James River, you might say, are a blending of the entire Commonwealth. And so that's why, and the Pocahontas happens to also be probably the single most productive soil in the Commonwealth as well. And many times the state record yields for small grains or corn or other products, soybeans, are set on the Pocahontas soil because of its wonderful physical and chemical properties. So it's a good representative for the Commonwealth.
Obviously, it's a very good soil. It was just 2 years ago that Virginia farmer David Hula set a world record for corn yield at 616 bushels of corn per acre on Pocahontas soil there along the James River.
Amazing. And it is an excellent soil because of its properties. It's not too clayey. It's not too sandy. It's right in the middle. It's got a good mixture of sand, silt, and clay. And then chemically, it's because the James River heads up in the limestone regions of the Valley and Ridge province, then it's bringing some calcium and magnesium and other nutrients that might be missing from some of the more highly weathered and leached soils that are found in other parts of the coastal plain. So it's uniquely fertile, natural fertility as well.
And that was Dr. John Galbraith with Virginia Tech. Another interesting guest during those early days was Ira Wallace. She's with the Southern Exposure Seed Exchange in Louisa County. Very interesting person, very interesting operation. And we asked Ira Wallace about her opinion concerning organic matter in soil health.
Well, we think having, an increased soil organic matter, like 5%, for example, you would be like going, whoa, look at that, because it just helps so much. It helps in nutrient availability. It helps with moisture retention. It helps when you have too much water with being able to cycle that through without, taking away the nutrients that are there. So I kind of joke when I'm telling gardeners, I say, there's hardly anything that's wrong in your garden that a little added organic matter wouldn't hurt. And you can do that. You can add that by taking living material from the garden and recycling it, by putting it in, by having biological mulches that are going to break down and go into the soil, by growing cover crops. We say anytime in the summer you have your soil open more than 5 weeks, you can throw some buckwheat in there and add enough organic matter to make a difference. And in the winter, when your garden is sleeping, if you aren't like us and throw so many greens in there that you have to fight between the cover cropping and the greens growing. But, all of that organic matter. And we also have taken to trying tree debris, shredded bark, not so much bark, but especially small limbs, really add to it.
Ira Wallace with the Southern Exposure Seed Exchange in Louisa County, Virginia. Another interesting conversation we had was with Chris Lawrence with the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. Here's a question from Eric Benfelt.
And as I said, you've really worked through the years to distill this key message and these key principles down to 4 principles: minimize soil disturbance, maximize living roots, energize with diversity, and keep the soil covered. And as you know, that each farm is different, and so we also have to take it into context and values. But those are 4 principles that people can really adapt and implement on their farms and in their operations.
One of the things that we have come to understand is that soil science is very intimidating, and it can be complicated. You and I both have master's degrees in that subject, but the truth is that we need to distill our messages down to the simplest form. And it really starts with what you called our 4th principle, but is really our first priority: keeping the soil covered. And the soil needs to be covered in order to prevent it from washing and blowing away to begin with. You can't have a healthy soil if you don't have soil at all. And so the first step in rebuilding our soil and its ability to provide food with lower inputs, to grow healthy plants with a minimum of fertilizer and so forth, is to keep it covered. And then we move on to the idea that soil was not meant to be put through a blender. A traditional approach to managing soil is to pulverize it, leave it bare, take pretty much everything it produces, but we have to give back. And so that's the idea of keeping the soil covered and minimizing disturbance.
Chris Lawrence with the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. And yet another interesting conversation we had was with Karen Washington, who I think all of us found her to be extremely inspiring when it comes to soil health. Here's a snippet of that conversation.
Karen, we talk a lot about the networks within the soil, those microbial networks and building the diversity of that. How do you see the work that you're doing on more of that metaphorical side, building community networks? And, how does working in the soil help build those connections among diverse communities?
Oh, definitely. And I think it starts with this sort of intergenerational knowledge that we're having, sitting down and having people who have knowledge about soil fertility, about how to grow food, about food justice, and sitting down and sharing that information. For so long, I think that we have been separate. We have been separate in hoarding the knowledge that we've have attained. And so it's really, really good that now you're starting to see this intergenerational aspect where the youth and the elders are now sitting down and cross-pollinating, so to speak, the language and the knowledge that they have, and sharing that knowledge was really, really good.
And Karen, you had also helped to co-found the Black Urban Growers Association or organization. And if you can, I know that's been involved with soil health and racial justice. If you can speak more about that as well.
Yeah, the reason why we started the Black Urban Growers is because of the fact that many of us with good intentions would go to different farming conferences and workshops and never see the diversity that we have. As farmers, we embrace diversity, but sitting in a pool of whiteness and not being able to see your participation in agriculture, we started to have this conversation so that young Black and brown people could see farmers that looked like them. For so long, you would go to farmers markets, you go to a conference, and you would never see Black farmers. And they were out there. So the conference was for young people to see, yes, there are Black farmers. There are Black people who are working on soil. There are Black people who are working in terms of environmental justice. And having that conference so that, again, what is our place as a people when it comes to the development of agriculture here in these United States? It takes a village, it takes diversity, and it's not one voice, one race, one color. It's the multitude of all of us coming together to making sure that this planet, the elements of this planet, is here for everybody. And I think that's important.
Karen Washington, who was one of our guests during the first few weeks of the podcast For the Soil, A Conversation. You're listening to a best of podcast. We're celebrating our first anniversary of For the Soil, A Conversation. And one of the conversations we had was with Virginia's Secretary of Agriculture and Forestry, Matt Lohr. Secretary Lohr, one question I'd like to hear your comment on is stream fencing and water purity, the Chesapeake Bay. For a number of years now, Virginia farmers have been actively participating in stream fencing programs, but from my understanding, we're not near where we need to be to improve the health of the Chesapeake Bay. But there seems to be a lot of controversy on that topic. What would you share with us about and I keep hearing the year 2025 as some kind of mandate year. What can you share in regard to stream fencing for livestock and what farmers should know now in 2022?
So, yes, we are part of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And for many years, the total maximum daily loads have been set for ag and forestry. And what that means is the amount of sediment that's coming into our waterways and the amount of nutrients that are running off the land. And certainly there's goals that we have to meet for the ag community, and the WIP 3, the Watershed Implementation Plan Phase 3 is due in 2025. The magical part of that number is up until this point, everything has been voluntary. Farmers have been able to be incentivized through cost share programs to try to meet these benchmarks voluntarily. But in 2025, the focus shifts from being voluntary to mandatory. And that's a big deal for the ag community. So our goal is to make sure that farmers know, the financial resources that are available, because through state programs and through federal programs, there really are a lot of dollars available so that the farmer is not bearing the primary burden of stream fencing. It's complicated because a lot of our land in Virginia and across the country is rented. And so if I'm an 85-year-old widow, for example, and I've got several hundred acres of farmland and I've got a stream through there, really, it may not be financially beneficial to me to to invest in something like that when I'm nearing the end of my life and I don't know who the next generation is going to be. So there's some of those challenges that we have to work through. But to me, I think the thing to remember is that we're at a time now where there's a lot of money available that has not always been there. And there's lots of programs. And so I've been beginning discussions with our Secretary of Natural Resources and the various state agencies of DCR and our conservation districts and certainly NRCS of how we can come together and look at the dollars and the programs that are out there and design a plan that'll be the most beneficial to reach these goals.
Virginia's Secretary of Agriculture and Forestry, Matt Lohr. And yet another interesting conversation we had was with Duron Chavis. That was in more recent weeks during our first year of the podcast For the Soil, a conversation. And here's a snippet of that conversation when he talked about something I think a lot of listeners found very interesting.
We're talking today with Duron Chavis, an urban farmer and community advocate in Richmond, Virginia. And Duron, I do have one question for you. I have to confess, I was doing some research about your work in Richmond, and I did an internet search with your name, and I came across a very interesting headline. And I'm just going to read it to you, and then I want you to tell us the story. The headline reads, "He bought a tractor with the money his mom left him when she died. Then someone stole it." Can you tell us that story?
Yeah. Oh, man. So, yeah, my mother passed in 2021 from breast cancer. It was a really swift experience, kind of found out like 3 months before, and then she was taken from us. But she worked for the federal government for years, her whole life. And so part of my last kind of reasonings with my mom was like, she really was enthralled by the work that we do in community. She really loved it. I mean, she had been away for a long time. And when I say away, like she lived in Cuba, lived in Japan. So she hadn't really put eyes on, the gardens and the spaces we had been developing. But when she came back at the height of COVID, or right before COVID popped off, she spent a lot of time with us in the garden spaces. And my last conversation with my mom was really just like, just keep doing what you're doing, and stay on that path. Keep succeeding is what she said. So when she passed, I took a lot of the inheritance that I received and started making investments in the work. And one of those investments was a tractor. So we went and bought a tractor. First time ever owning, a little utility tractor. So, I felt like a little kid. We would park the tractor at the orchard. In the cut, I guess, behind one of our mini murals at the space. And one day we come to the garden and the tractor was gone. It was devastating. Really, really, really sad moment. You know what I mean? That somebody decided to take it. But the dope part about it is that our community rallied around us and supported us in fundraising. And, not even a month later, we got a whole nother tractor with that was even better than the first one. I mean, we were able to buy the tractor, got a utility trailer, air tags to keep track of where it is, pallet loader attachment. So it was like we came back better than before.
A very special conversation with guest Duron Chavis. And that just goes to show you it's not always about the soil, but about the people who work with the soil. I want to say thank you to our co-host Eric Benfelt and Mary Sketch Bryant for this incredible first year. We have met and talked with some really interesting people, and I look forward to the next year as we continue For the Soil, a conversation. It's made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund, Other partners include the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, just visit the website forthesoil.org. And if you have a specific question about soil health, just call your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or a Soil and Water Conservation District office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of the Flip Charts. All rights reserved. For the Soil, a Conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii.